For years, the most famous sound in television history didn't exist on paper. It was a stage direction. 2 words in brackets, sitting in a script, waiting for someone to decide what they meant. Annoyed grunt. That was it. That was the whole instruction. I think about that more than is probably reasonable. Anyway, this is the plan for the next couple of hours. We're going wandering through The Simpsons, not the episodes, not the jokes you already know by heart, but the sediment underneath. 37 seasons and over 800 episodes is enough television to develop actual archaeology, and most of what's buried in there never comes up in conversation because there's simply no room for it. There's no order to any of this, no big reveal at the end. The sections sit next to each other rather than building on each other, so if you drift off somewhere around the middle, you haven't missed anything. That's rather the point. If you like this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button, and I'd appreciate it. Right, that's the housekeeping done. Let's start in the hallway in 1987. Picture a man sitting outside an office, about to make the worst deal of his life. The year is 1987. Matt Groening is a cartoonist with a cult following, mostly on the strength of a strip called Life in Hell, which ran in alternative weeklies and was, depending on your taste, either brilliantly bleak or just bleak. James L. Brooks had seen it. Brooks was a genuinely enormous figure in American television and film at that point, and he wanted animated shorts for a sketch show he was producing called The Tracy Ullman Show. He wanted Life in Hell. And Groening, sitting in that lobby, did the maths. Signing Life in Hell over to a television studio meant handing away the rights to the thing he'd built his whole career on. He'd lose control of it. So in the time it took to be called into that meeting, he sketched out something else entirely. A family, 5 of them, rough, ugly, spiky-haired, drawn fast because fast was all he had. That's the origin, not a vision, not years of development. A man protecting his rabbits by inventing something he assumed nobody would care about. Now, the names. Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Maggie are all lifted directly from Groening's own family. His father was Homer. His mother was Marge. His sisters were Lisa and Maggie, which means that for nearly 4 decades, hundreds of millions of people have been watching a cartoon about a man being strangled by his own son, and the man is named after the creator's dad. Bart is the exception, and he's the exception for 2 reasons. The first is that Bart is an anagram of brat, which is the sort of joke that seems too neat to be true and is in fact entirely true. The second reason is better. Groening has said he originally wanted to name the boy Matt after himself and decided against it because he thought it would go down badly in a pitch meeting. Imagine sitting in a room with executives and explaining that the naughty one is you. The short started airing on the 19th of April, 1987. 48 of them went out over roughly 2 years before Fox aired the series. And I would encourage you to go and look at them because they are genuinely rough. The character models drift. Homer's head changes shape between shots. Marge's hair does whatever it feels like. Bart has this unsettling quality where his eyes don't quite point the same direction. They were animated at speed on a tiny budget, and it shows in every frame. Fun fact about those shorts, and this is the bit that connects to where we started. In a short called Punching Bag, broadcast on the 27th of November 1988, Homer takes a punching bag to the face and makes a noise. That noise is the first deliberate use of the sound we're all thinking of. Before the series existed, before the theme tune existed, before anyone had any reason to believe this thing would run longer than most marriages. We'll come back to that sound properly later because there's a whole story sitting behind it, and it deserves its own space rather than being crammed in here. The series proper arrived on the 17th of December 1989 with a Christmas episode. And there's a lovely bit of accidental history in that, which I'll save for when we talk about how the show actually gets made, because the reason a Christmas special ended up being the pilot has nothing to do with Christmas. The thing I find hard to get over is the sheer contingency of it. Every single element that people now treat as iconic was a hedge, a compromise, or a mistake. The family exists because Groening didn't want to sell his comic strip. The name Bart exists because Matt sounded embarrassing out loud. The most quoted noise in television exists because a script said annoyed grunt and left the rest blank. There's something quite reassuring about that, actually. The biggest cultural object of the last 40 years of American television was assembled out of shortcuts by people who assumed it wouldn't last. While we're here, a bit more on life in hell because it's the thing that got sacrificed to make room and nobody talks about it. It's a strip about a rabbit called Binky who is miserable, and it ran in alternative weekly papers from around 1980. It's genuinely bleak. There are installments that are essentially lists of reasons to be unhappy at work, drawn as rabbits. Groening had built a modest living out of it, self-publishing collections and selling them by post, and it had the sort of devoted readership that alternative comics get, which is to say small and intense. That's what Brooks wanted. That's what Groening refused to hand over in the lobby. And the strip carried on for another 30-odd years afterwards, running until 2012. Which means Groening was quietly producing a weekly comic about a depressed rabbit the entire time he was running the biggest cartoon on television. The shorts themselves were structured as bumpers. They'd run either side of the advert breaks in the Tracy Ullman show, typically under 2 minutes, often much less. Some are barely a single joke. There's one where Homer tries to get the children to sleep. There's one that's essentially just Bart being irritating in a supermarket. They weren't stories so much as sketches of a household. And here's a slightly awkward footnote to all of it. Tracy Ullman later took legal action seeking a share of the profits, on the reasonable-sounding basis that the characters had been launched on her program. She lost. The ruling went with the studio, and the shorts were treated as material produced for the show rather than material owned by it. The other thing worth remembering is what Fox actually was in 1989. It was not a network in the sense that the others were. It was a fourth option that had existed for about 3 years. It didn't broadcast every night of the week, and it had very little to lose by putting an animated sitcom about a dysfunctional family into prime time, which nobody had done successfully since the early 60s. That gamble paid off almost immediately. The show's first season put Fox into the top 30 most watched programs in the country for the first time in the network's existence. Not the top 30 animated shows, the top 30 full stop. So the whole arrangement is a set of people with nothing to lose, betting on each other, a cartoonist protecting a rabbit strip, a producer taking a flyer on an unknown, and a network that couldn't afford to be precious about it. Here's a design problem that I'd never thought about until someone pointed it out, and now I can't unsee it. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie don't have hairlines. Look at them, really look. There's no line separating skin from hair. Their hair points come straight out of their heads as extensions of the same shape, the same outline, the same color field. There's no boundary anywhere on the face where you could reasonably say the skin stops and the hair begins. So what color do you make them? If you go with a normal flesh tone, you end up with 3 children whose heads appear to have been dipped in something. It looks wrong. It looks, and I'm quoting the general reaction here, freakish. Mike Rice, who wrote for the show and later ran it, put it about as plainly as anyone has in his book Springfield Confidential. The animators chose yellow because yellow is a bit skin and a bit hair at the same time. It sits in the gap. It solves a problem that only exists because of how the characters were drawn in the first place. David Silverman, who directed enormous amounts of the early show, has said much the same thing. His view was that flesh tone simply wouldn't have worked on those particular designs. Now the person who actually made the call. Her name is Georgie Kovacs-Pelus, and she was a color designer at Klasky Tsupo, the studio animating the Tracy Ullman shorts. Groening, by his own admission, had assumed the whole thing would be black and white. He was a newspaper cartoonist. Black and white was what he knew. The studio came back and said they'd mock up some color designs at no cost. Pelus made the family yellow. She also gave Marge blue hair, which is arguably the more insane decision of the two. There was internal resistance. Some people at Gracie Films, which is Brooks's production company, thought it looked bizarre. But Groening looked at Marge, yellow skin, blue hair, and reportedly said something along the lines of, "That's hilarious, let's do it." And here's the part I find slightly sad. Groening himself has said publicly that Georgi Kovacs-Palus has never been given proper credit for it. The single most recognizable color scheme in the history of animation, a visual identity worth an unimaginable amount of money, and the person who chose it is a footnote that people like me have to go looking for. There's a second explanation that gets given for the yellow, and it's the one Groening tends to lead with in interviews. It's about the television dial. In the late 80s, you had a handful of channels and a remote control, and you'd flick through them at speed. Fox was a new network nobody had much reason to stop on. Groening's line, which he's repeated in various forms for decades, is that if a flash of yellow goes past while you're flicking, you know exactly what you're watching. Both things can be true. The animator solved a drawing problem, and the creator recognized a marketing weapon when he saw one. While we're on design, the hands. Everyone in Springfield has 4 fingers. This isn't a Simpsons invention, it's a standard animation shortcut going back decades. Because drawing one fewer finger on every hand in every frame across an entire series adds up to an enormous amount of saved labor. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of drawings and you're saving weeks. The exceptions are the fun bit. God has 5 fingers, so does Jesus. It's a small, consistent rule the show has stuck to for decades, and nobody ever draws attention to it. It's just quietly true. I've seen a story going around for years that Marge's hair was originally meant to be hiding rabbit ears, a callback to Life in Hell with a plan to reveal it in the final episode. I've never been able to find Groening actually saying it, so I'm going to leave it there rather than pass it on as fact. It's a lovely idea. I suspect it's just a lovely idea. What I like about the yellow in the end is that it was never a statement. It wasn't a bold artistic choice about race or identity or anything else people have since written essays about. It was a colorist thinking about viewers flicking through channels and reaching for the one color that would make them stop. There's a wider design grammar underneath the yellow, and once you see it, you notice it constantly. Nearly everyone in Springfield has an overbite. It's on the model sheets. The mouth sits forward of the chin line, which is why characters can be drawn in profile and still read instantly. Nearly everyone has the same enormous white circular eyes with a small dot in them, which is why the show can convey an expression using essentially 2 pixels of pupil position. Homer's entire emotional range is those dots moving about half a centimeter. And then Marge, who breaks the rules completely. She's the tallest thing in most shots because of the hair, which creates a persistent staging problem. If Marge is in a room, the composition has to accommodate a blue tower. Animators have talked about the hair as a genuine nuisance, and you can see them working around it in interiors where the ceiling suddenly seems higher than it was in the previous shot. The color choice also turned out to have a commercial consequence nobody had planned for. By 1990, the show had produced what people at the time called Bartmania, and the scale of it is difficult to convey now. T-shirts, posters, dolls, badges, lunchboxes, novelty telephones. The merchandising became a billion-dollar business, and a substantial part of why it works so well is that a yellow figure with spiked hair is recognizable at any size, in any print quality, on any surface. You can render it badly on a market stall t-shirt and it still reads as Bart, which is precisely what happened. There was an entire underground economy of unlicensed shirts in 1990, the most famous being the Black Bart designs, which reworked the character and sold in enormous numbers without a penny going to any one official. Schools in America started banning Bart merchandise on the grounds that he was a bad influence, which had the effect that banning things generally has, which is that everyone wanted one. That's the odd afterlife of a color choice made to solve a hairline. A design decision taken to stop 3 children looking strange in close-up turned out to be the most efficient piece of visual branding of the decade, and it made a fortune for people who had nothing to do with it. Everyone reading this has seen the title sequence somewhere north of 1,000 times. And I'd bet most of us have never actually watched it. It's about 90 seconds, and there are 3 moving parts that change: the chalkboard, the saxophone solo, and the couch. Everything else is fixed. That structure is so familiar now that it's essentially furniture, but it was a strange thing to commit to in 1989 because it means every single episode requires 3 brand new bits of animation before the story even starts. The chalkboard gag is the most fragile of the 3, and that's by design. It's typically one of the last things written, which means it's also one of the first things cut when an episode runs long. That's why some episodes simply don't have one. Bart skateboards past an empty board and nobody comments. There's one chalkboard gag I want to flag now because it'll matter in a bit. On the 15th of April 2012, the board read, "The true location of Springfield is in any state but yours." That was a direct response to something that had happened in the press that week, and we'll get to what that was shortly. Then the saxophone. Lisa gets thrown out of band practice, plays her solo, and cycles home. What I appreciate about that beat is that it's the only place in the entire sequence where a character does something genuinely skilled. Homer fumbles a fuel rod. Marge and Maggie get through a checkout. Bart commits minor property crime. Lisa plays properly. It's a small piece of characterization buried in a title card, repeated 800 times, and I doubt 1 viewer in 1,000 has consciously registered it. The couch gag is the elastic one. It's the only element that can be stretched to fill time, which is precisely why it exists. If an episode came in short, you extended the couch gag. If it ran long, you cut it down to 4 seconds. It's a rubber band that happens to also be the funniest recurring bit in the show. And because it's the flexible slot, it became the place to hand over to guests. Banksy did one in 2010, which turned into a whole news cycle. Bill Plimpton has done several, including one where Homer has a romantic history with the couch, which is exactly as unhinged as it sounds. John Krifaluzzi, the Ren and Stimpy man, has done one. There was even an episode where they binned the standard opening entirely and replaced it with a Lady Gaga number, and her public response was, as far as I can tell, 1 word of approval on Twitter. No notes. Now the checkout. Maggie gets scanned at the till, and there's a number on the register. The number in the classic sequence is 847.63, and the story that has circled the internet for years is that it was the estimated monthly cost of raising a baby in America in 1989. I want to be straight with you here. That explanation has been repeated absolutely everywhere, including by outlets that ought to check things, but the trail leads back to fan documentation and a viral post rather than anything I'd call a primary source. So treat it as the thing fans have said for 30 years, rather than the thing the show confirmed. What is solid is what happened to the number afterwards. When the sequence was rebuilt for high definition, the till reads 243.26 before Maggie goes through and 486.52 after, which is a cleaner and slightly meaner joke. The baby exactly doubles the bill. In Treehouse of Horror, the 24th, the register reads 666, which is the sort of thing you only notice on a rewatch. And then there's a beautiful bit of circular nonsense. In an episode called The Simpsons 138th Episode Spectacular, an announcer tells the audience that the register actually reads NRA for ever. It doesn't. It never has. That was a joke about a rumor that fans had been trading for years, and the joke has since been mistaken for the answer often enough that it now circulates as a fact in its own right. A show making fun of its own fan mythology, and the mockery becoming part of the mythology. The whole sequence was rebuilt for widescreen high definition in an episode called Take My Life Please, which went out on the 15th of February 2009. New animation, new gags, more characters crammed into the town square, and a Maggie who now appears to drive the car from her baby seat. Some people never forgave it. I quite like it, though I'll admit I can only hear the original in my head. A couple of smaller things about the sequence that I find quite pleasing. The music itself was rearranged early on. The version in the first season isn't quite the version people remember, It was reworked for the second, and then the arrangement most of us actually hear in our heads arrived at the start of the third. So there's a 2-year period where the show sounds subtly wrong to anyone who came to it later. And if you go back to those first episodes cold, that's usually the thing that registers before anything else does. The chalkboard is also the only part of the show that has to be written every single week, regardless of anything else. Story ideas can be shelved. Jokes can be moved between episodes. The chalkboard cannot be reused because the whole gag depends on it being new, so somebody has to produce one every time, forever, hundreds of them now. Some of the best ones are pointedly unfunny on purpose, which I think is a sign of a room enjoying itself. There are ones that are simply statements of fact. There are ones that reference specific production problems. And there are ones that function as apologies, which is a strange thing for a television program to have a mechanism for. In the high-definition version, Maggie's beat changes slightly. In the original, she's scanned, bagged, and looks around. In the newer one, she stands up in the trolley and mimes driving it, which is a small piece of character growth for someone who has been the same age since the 80s. The widescreen rebuild also crams the town square full of characters. There's a genuine game to be played, pausing it and counting how many recurring figures they managed to fit in, and the answer is dozens. It's a class photo disguised as a title sequence, and it's the show quietly acknowledging that after 20 years, the cast had stopped being a family and become a population. The last thing I'll say about the opening is that it's one of the only pieces of television furniture that has survived essentially unchanged into an era where nothing else has. Most long-running shows shorten their titles or drop them or move them to the end. This one kept 90 seconds of it every week for decades and made 3 of those seconds different every time. The couch gag has occasionally escaped its own slot entirely, and there's a Halloween example I'll come back to later. There have been couch gags that are stop motion, ones done in the style of other animation studios, ones that are jokes about the show's own age, where the family arrived to find the sofa occupied by their earlier designs. And there have been a few where the joke is that the couch gag has been canceled for budget reasons, which is a joke about the flexible slot being flexible. The reason this works and the reason it's lasted is that the audience has been trained. Everyone watching knows the shape of the 90 seconds. You know Homer will arrive last. You know the car will pull in. You know where everyone sits. So any deviation, however small, registers instantly without setup on a viewer who is half paying attention while making a cup of tea. That's a genuinely rare thing to have built. Most television has to explain its jokes. This one has a slot where it can subvert an expectation it spent decades installing every single week and never has to say a word about it. The thing that took me longest to properly appreciate about this show is how small the cast actually is. Springfield contains, at a conservative count, several hundred speaking characters. The overwhelming majority of them come out of about 6 people standing in a room. Hank Azaria and Harry Shearer between them carry an absurd proportion of the town. Shearer has Burns, Smithers, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Otto, Kent Brockman, Lenny, Reverend Lovejoy, Dr. Hibbert for years, and Jasper, among others. There are scenes in this show where Shearer is having a 4-way conversation entirely with himself. Azaria has Moe, Chief Wiggum, comic book guy, Carl, Superintendent Chalmers, Cletus, Professor Frink, Snake, and for a very long time, Apu. Nancy Cartwright is Bart, which everyone knows, and she is also Nelson, Ralph Wiggum, Todd Flanders, and Kearney, which means that in any given schoolyard scene, half the boys are one woman. The recording process is the part I find weirdly comforting. They record as an ensemble, around a table, reading together, rather than each actor coming in separately to record their lines into the void. That's not how most animation works now. Most modern animation is recorded in isolation because it's cheaper and easier to schedule, and you can usually hear it. The performances don't quite lock together. The Simpsons has kept people in the same room, and the timing you get from that, the overlaps and the reactions, is a large part of why the dialogue sounds like conversation rather than alternating monologue. The money is its own story, and it's a story about leverage. For most of the first decade, the 6 principal actors were on roughly $30,000 an episode, which sounds fine until you consider what the show was earning. In 1998, they threatened to strike, and the figure went up to around $125,000. In 2004, they stopped turning up to script reads, and it went up again to somewhere around $360,000. By 2008, the reported figure was about $400,000 an episode. Then, in 2011, the direction reversed. Fox threatened to cancel the show outright unless production costs came down by 45%. The cast took a substantial reduction, reportedly to around $300,000, but without any share of the back end instead, which is either a pay cut or a very good long-term trade, depending on how the accounting shakes out, and I'd love to know which. In May 2015, Harry Shearer left. Actually left publicly over contract terms. He was back by July. It was resolved quietly, and the whole thing lasted about 2 months. But for those 2 months, there was a genuine possibility that the show would have to recast Mr. Burns, which I'm not sure it could have survived. In 2020, the show announced that white actors would no longer voice non-white characters. Dr. Hibbert and Carl were recast. Azaria had already stepped away from Apu. After several years of public conversation about the character that we'll come back to when we talk about the show's relationship with its own past. And then the pandemic, which produced my favorite piece of production trivia in this whole section. In March 2020, the entire operation went remote. The cast recorded from home. The table read, "The thing I've just spent several paragraphs explaining is essential to how the show sounds," moved on to video calls. And they didn't miss an episode. A show that had been recording in the same building for 30 years reassembled itself over the internet in a matter of weeks and kept going. I don't know why that's the detail that sticks with me. Possibly because it's so unglamorous. 6 people in 6 houses in their own airing cupboards or whatever they'd converted, being Springfield. A bit more on who does what, because the distribution is stranger than you'd guess. Dan Castellaneta doesn't just have Homer, he has Grandpa, which is a completely different vocal placement. He has Krusty, which is Homer's voice pushed through gravel and cigarettes, a resemblance the show has explicitly joked about. He has Barney, he has Groundskeeper Willie, he has Itchy, he has the mayor's aides and half the incidental men in town. On any given week, he's likely playing 4 or 5 characters who have conversations with each other. Julie Kavner does Marge and also Patty and Selma, which means one performer covers most of the Bouvier family. Her voice is genuinely distinctive rather than a put-on, and the rasp is real, which is why Marge sounds like nobody else in animation. Yeardley Smith is the outlier. She plays Lisa, and essentially only Lisa. In a cast where everyone else is juggling multiple roles, one person has a single character and has had that single character for 37 years. Kelsey Grammer has been Sideshow Bob since the first season, which is a fact I find slightly disorienting. He's appeared in the region of 20-odd episodes across the run, which averages out to less than 1 a year, and yet he's one of the most fixed presences in the show. He also sings properly. There's an entire episode built around him performing the whole of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. And that works because he can genuinely do it. The awards record reflects the workload. The show has won something like 16 Emmys for voice performance, spread across most of the principal cast, which is more than any other program has managed in that category because most programs don't ask one person to be 9 people before lunch. And there's a practical detail I like, because the cast records together, the read-throughs are also where the writers find out what's working. A joke that dies at the table gets cut before a single frame is drawn. Given how expensive and slow the drawing is, the table read is effectively the last cheap opportunity to be wrong, and everybody in the room knows it. Where the voices came from is its own small pleasure because a surprising number of them started as impressions of somebody specific. Mo is, by Hank Azaria's own account, an impression of Al Pacino. Not a good one, deliberately. He was asked to read for a gruff bartender, reached for Pacino, missed, and the miss became a character who has now been in several hundred episodes. Chief Wiggum came out of Edward G. Robinson, the old Hollywood gangster actor, which is why he has that particular rolling delivery that sounds like it belongs in a much more serious film. Comic book guy was reportedly closer to an accident. A pompous adenoidal register that Azaria produced for a one-off part, which stuck because the writers realized they had somewhere to put every joke about fandom for the next 30 years. Mr. Burns is generally described as a blend, with the old actor Lionel Barrymore in there, and depending on who you ask, a little of Ronald Reagan's cadence. What makes it work is the thinness of it. Burns doesn't sound powerful. He sounds like a man being held together by staff, which is exactly right for someone who cannot lift a telephone receiver but owns the town. And this is the part that I think explains why the ensemble has aged as well as it has. None of these were designed as cartoon voices. They were built out of specific human beings that the performers had watched and enjoyed. That gives them a floor. A cartoon voice is a shape you make with your mouth and it wears out. An impression of a person, even a bad one, has a personality underneath holding it up, which is presumably how you get away with doing the same voice every week for the better part of 4 decades without either you or the audience going mad. There's a shot in this show where Lisa points at a map and says, "There we are." And the camera moves to follow her finger, and Bart's head slides into frame at exactly the right moment to block it. That's the whole joke, sustained for 30-odd years. Springfield is somewhere. You are never going to find out where. The show has been ruthlessly disciplined about this. Springfield has been placed near mountains, near a desert, near a coastline, near farmland, and near what appears to be Arctic tundra, depending entirely on what the episode needs that week. In the 2007 film, Ned Flanders takes Bart up a hill and tells him you can see the 4 states that border Springfield from there: Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. Those 4 states do not touch each other. They aren't within 1,000 miles of touching each other. The joke is that the writers have handed you a definitive answer that is geometrically impossible. Al Jean, who ran the show for 2 decades, once said there genuinely is an answer if you just put all the clues together and then made it clear he was winding people up. Now, April 2012, and the thing that briefly broke this, Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine, and in it he said that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon. His reasoning was lovely and personal. As a child, he watched Father Knows Best, which was set in a town called Springfield, and he'd assumed it was the Springfield near Portland, where he grew up. He later worked out it was fictional, and he also worked out that Springfield is one of the most common town names in America. So he took it on the theory that everyone watching would assume it was theirs. And in his words, they do. This went off like a bomb. It was reported everywhere as the end of a 23-year mystery. Springfield, Oregon, which had already leaned into it with a couch in their local museum, was quietly delighted. And then 2 days later, Groening spoke to TV Guide and said this: "I never said Springfield was in Oregon. I said Springfield was the name of my sled," which is a Citizen Kane reference and also an absolute refusal to be pinned down. Only the Springfield, Oregon statement is real. Only the claim about naming it after Springfield, Oregon is actually on the record from that week. And rather than trying to work out which one he meant, I'd suggest the honest reading is that he named the town after a place he knew, and separately, he has spent his entire career refusing to let anyone locate the fictional one. He said as much elsewhere. When people tell him it's Springfield, Massachusetts, or Springfield, Illinois, he just agrees with them. That week is also when the chalkboard I mentioned earlier appeared. The true location of Springfield is in any state but yours. The show responding to its own creator's press coverage many months later in a gag most viewers wouldn't have had the context for. Here's the layer underneath, though, and this is the part that actually holds up. An enormous number of Springfield surnames are streets in Portland, Oregon: Flanders, Lovejoy, Kearney, Quimby, Terwilliger, which is Sideshow Bob's actual surname, Robert Underdunk Terwilliger, and Evergreen Terrace, which was the street Groening's own family lived on. Groening has said the original plan was to name every single character after a Portland street, and that he abandoned it because they were in a hurry. Which is, once again, the answer to almost every question about this show's early years. They were in a hurry. So Springfield is nowhere, and it's also very specifically the street map of one man's childhood, rearranged into people. I find that a much better answer than a state would have been. Since we're on the subject of the town's identity, there's the matter of who founded it. Jebediah Springfield is the town's mythic figure. Statue in the square, portrait in the school, the whole apparatus of civic hero worship. The official story is that he tamed a buffalo with his bare hands and led settlers to the site after a vision. In an episode from season 7, Lisa finds a document rolled up inside his flute, and it turns out his real name was Hans Sprungfeld. He was a murderous pirate with a silver prosthetic tongue. He shot the buffalo rather than taming it, and he once tried to kill George Washington. His famous motto, "The one carved into everything," was fabricated. The town's founder is a fraud with a false tongue. And Lisa, having proved all of this, chooses not to tell anyone, because she watches how much the myth means to people on the day of the parade, and decides the truth isn't worth what it would cost. That's an unusually grown-up ending for a cartoon, and it's the same episode that produced the invented vocabulary I mentioned earlier, which is a lot of freight for 21 minutes. Then there's Shelbyville, the neighboring town and permanent rival. The founding story there is that Jebediah and Shelbyville, Manhattan disagreed on a point of principle and split the settlement between them. The point of principle, as told in the show, is not one I'm going to spell out at this hour, but it is deeply unflattering to Shelbyville and entirely in character for a founding myth. Shelbyville functions as a mirror. It has its own Speedy Mart, its own school, its own version of everything, all slightly wrong. It's the show making a joke about how small towns construct an entire identity out of not being the next town over, which is, I'd argue, one of the truest things it has ever observed about anywhere. And none of this helps you locate it either. Two towns, a shared origin myth, a buffalo, a pirate, and no coordinates. There's a whole subgenre of fan work devoted to solving this, and I have a soft spot for it, even though it can't be done. People have compiled the license plates, the area codes, the postal codes, the road signs, the sports teams, and the weather, and built cases for pretty much every state in the country. The evidence contradicts itself constantly because it was written by different people over 37 years with no shared reference document. And because whenever the writers noticed a consistent clue emerging, they would deliberately break it. You'll see a state abbreviation on an envelope for half a second, and it won't match the one on a road sign 2 seasons earlier. Characters drive somewhere in an afternoon that would take 2 days. The coastline appears and vanishes. The best summary I've seen of the whole exercise came from someone pointing out that Springfield isn't a place with an unknown location, it's a place with a deliberately impossible one, and that looking for it is a bit like asking which side of the road runs on. Still, people keep making the maps. I've watched several videos doing exactly that, and enjoyed all of them, and I don't think a single person involved actually wants an answer. Let's take a walk around the place instead, because the town works as a piece of civil engineering, and I don't think it gets enough credit for that. The dominant structure is the nuclear plant, 2 cooling towers visible from essentially everywhere, positioned so that they're in the background of a huge proportion of establishing shots. It's the town's largest employer and its largest hazard, and the show has never once treated those as being in tension. Then there's the gorge, which exists purely so that things can be jumped over it and fallen into it. There's the tire fire, which has been burning continuously since the early 90s and has never been extinguished, put out, or seriously addressed by anyone. There's an escalator that goes up several stories and simply stops, delivering people into open air, which was built by the town and is described by Marge as another civic folly. My favorite piece of Springfield civic history is the monorail, and specifically what it left behind. Marge versus the monorail went out in season 4. and it was written by Conan O'Brien during his short spell on the staff before he left for late-night television. The premise is that a con man arrives in town, sings a song, and persuades everyone to spend a windfall on a monorail that does not work. The bit that stuck, though, is the list. Ogdenville, North Haverbrook, Brockway. 3 towns that had already been sold monorails and destroyed by them, delivered in a song lyric, and now permanently part of the show's geography. North Haverbrook in particular gets referenced for years afterwards as a place that was ruined and covered up. An entire regional history invented as a throwaway rhyme. Then you have the commercial layer, Quickie Mart, Moe's, Lardlad Donuts with the enormous statue out front, Duff Brewery, the Krusty Burger chain. These are jokes about American retail that have since been built as physical, standing structures at Universal Parks, where you can go and buy an actual donut from Lardlad. Springfield, USA opened at Universal Studios Florida in 2013 with a Kang and Kodos ride attached, which means a gag about alien invaders from a Halloween special is now a spinning fairground attraction that small children queue for. And in 2007, the film put a dome over all of it. Russ Cargill, voiced by Albert Brooks, decides the simplest solution to Springfield's pollution is to seal the town under enormous glass. Homer causes the pollution. Homer has to fix it. That's the film. What strikes me about all of this is how little of Springfield is aspirational. Most fictional towns are either idealized or nightmarish. Springfield is neither. It's a place with a failing school, a corrupt mayor, a permanent fire at the dump, a police force that doesn't investigate anything, and a nuclear facility with an inspection record that would have it closed in about 90 seconds. And people stay. Nobody leaves. There's a whole episode about the family moving away and coming back, and dozens more where someone gets an opportunity elsewhere and turns it down. The town is dreadful, and everyone loves it, which is, I'd argue, a more accurate portrait of how people feel about where they're from than almost anything else on television. I've got a whole video's worth of material in the film alone, which I'll get to eventually. Let's go inside 2 buildings because they're the ones the show has thought hardest about. Springfield Elementary is a study in institutional decay. The roof leaks. The equipment is decades out of date. There's an ongoing situation with asbestos. Funding is so poor that the school has sold advertising space, rented out facilities, and at various points simply stopped teaching subjects. Principal Skinner runs it with the resigned energy of a man managing a controlled demolition, and Superintendent Chalmers turns up periodically to be disappointed. And underneath the jokes, there's a fairly pointed argument about what happens to public education in a town where the largest employer pays no attention to it. Then the plant. Homer's workstation is Sector 7G, and his job title is Safety Inspector, which the show has never once softened. He sleeps at the desk. Warning lights are ignored. Waste is stored in ways that would be criminal. Blinky, the 3-eyed fish, gets pulled out of the river downstream, and the response is not to fix anything but to run a public relations campaign. The plant is owned by Mr. Burns, and one of the sharper running details is that Burns has no idea who Homer is. Not as a joke about memory, as a joke about class. He has had this conversation dozens of times and it never sticks, because Homer's not a person to him, he's a line item. Then there's Krustyland, which is a theme park run by a man who despises children, staffed indifferently, and maintained badly. Rides break, safety standards are decorative. The mascot is a chain-smoking clown with tax problems. What ties all of these together is that Springfield's institutions are all run by someone who doesn't believe in them. The school by a man who wanted a military career. The plant by a man who wants money. The park by a man who wants an audience. The church by a minister who has lost interest and would rather be with his model trains. The police force by a man who is, at best, a bystander. That's the actual joke of the town, underneath the tire fire and the escalator. Everything works badly because everyone running it is doing something else with their life. And then there's Moe's, which is the show's other home. It's a windowless bar with a permanently sticky floor, a rat problem, and a clientele of 4 men who are there every single day. Barney, for most of the run, is functionally a fixture rather than a customer. Lenny and Carl arrive together and leave together and are almost never seen apart. Homer's there most evenings. That's it. That's the entire economy of the place, and the show has never explained how it stays open. Moe's prank calls are one of the show's oldest running gags, and they're a good example of how a joke survives by mutating. Bart phones and asks for a customer with a name that becomes an insult when Moe shouts it across the room. It's an old playground trick. It was recycled from a genuine long-running prank call routine, and the show did it for years until the names got so elaborate that the joke became watching Moe try to pronounce them. What's kept the location interesting, though, is Moe himself. He's one of the few characters the show has been consistently willing to make properly sad rather than comically sad. There are episodes about his loneliness that don't resolve. There's a recurring implication that he has nowhere else to be and no one waiting for him. He has repeatedly tried to change the bar into something else, a family restaurant, a fashionable lounge, a British pub, and every time it fails and reverts. That reversion is the whole town in miniature. Springfield's institutions cannot be improved, only redecorated, and by next week the paint will be off again. There's also a decent argument that Moe's is the most realistic location in the program. A dim room where the same handful of people turn up at the same time every day because the alternative is going home. There's nothing exaggerated about that at all. For a show where nobody ages, The Simpsons keeps a surprisingly large graveyard. Dr. Marvin Monroe is the strangest case. He was a fixture in the early seasons, the shouty therapist with the enormous glasses, and then he simply stopped appearing. One episode eventually explained Dr. Marvin Monroe's disappearance. He faded. Later, the show put up a memorial hospital named after him, effectively confirming he died off screen, and then years after that, he turned up again alive, explaining vaguely that he'd been very sick. That's 3 contradictory positions on one man's mortality, held simultaneously, with no attempt at reconciliation. Bleeding gums, Murphy went properly. Lisa's mentor, the jazz musician, given a genuine death episode and never brought back. Maud Flanders is the one that changed things. She was killed in season 11 in an episode called Alone Again, Natra Diddly, and the show did not undo it. Ned was a widower for a time, but has since remarried. That's now been the case for considerably longer than she was alive on the program. Whatever you think of the episode itself, an opinion is divided, the commitment afterwards was real. Then there's the loss that the show couldn't ride around at all. Phil Hartman died in 1998. He voiced Troy McClure, the washed-up actor with the filmography of educational films, and Lionel Hutz, the lawyer with the standards of a lawyer in a Simpsons episode. Both characters were enormously popular and easily recastable in the technical sense. The show retired them instead. Nobody else was ever going to say "You may remember me from," and the producers decided that was correct. Marcia Wallace played Edna Krabappel for over 2 decades. When she died in 2013, the character was retired, and her death was later confirmed inside the show with a chalkboard reading, "We'll really miss you, Mrs. K." Ned had married Edna by that point, which means the show has now widowed the same character twice, for 2 entirely different real-world reasons. There are others, and the pattern is inconsistent in a way I find quite human. Fat Tony died of a heart attack in season 22, and was immediately replaced by his cousin Fit Tony, who then ate his way into being the new Fat Tony, which is a joke about recasting disguised as a plot. Krusty's father, Rabbi Krustovsky, died in season 26. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, died definitively in season 19 after having already sort of died once before. And then there's Larry. Larry Dalrymple was a barfly. He sat in Moe's from the very first season and said almost nothing for over 3 decades. In season 35, in an episode called Cremains of the Day, he died. And the plot is that Homer, Lenny, Carl, and Moe are forced to admit they knew nothing whatsoever about a man they had drunk beside for 30 years. They can't fill a eulogy. They don't know his surname. That's a show taking one of its own background models, a piece of set dressing, and asking what it means that he was there the whole time and nobody looked at him. Most recently, Duffman was retired in season 37 in an episode that went out at the start of 2026. I said at the top that this show has archaeology, and this is where you feel it most. There are people in Springfield who exist now only as absences. New viewers won't notice a single one of them because you can't miss someone you never met. The Apu situation is the most complicated one and deserves more than a sentence. Apu Nahasapima Petalon was, for most of the show's run, one of its most developed supporting characters. He has a full backstory, a doctorate in computer science, a graduate thesis, an arranged marriage that becomes a real one, 8 children, and an entire episode about his immigration status, which is unusually sincere for the program. He was also voiced by Hank Azaria, doing an accent, and by the 2010s that had become the thing people saw first. The comedian Hari Kondabolu made a documentary about it in 2017 called The Problem with Apu, which argued that for a generation of South Asian kids in America, the character had been the only representation available and had followed them around the playground. The show's first response in an episode broadcast in April 2018 was to have Lisa address the camera about stories that were praised in their time aging badly, with a photo of Apu in shot. That went down poorly with nearly everybody, including people who had been sympathetic to the show. Azaria stepped away from the role in 2020 and has spoken about it at length since, generally with more grace than he was obliged to. Apu has been essentially absent ever since, not recast and not written out, which leaves the character in a strange, suspended state. I'll leave the argument itself alone. What interests me structurally is that this is the same show that retired Troy McClure rather than recast him, and the same show that has never once explained where Dr. Marvin Monroe went. It doesn't have a policy, it has instincts, and they're inconsistent, and they change with whoever is in charge. While we're on absences, there's a running gag I've always liked. The family cat is Snowball the Second. The original Snowball was run over before the series began. Later episodes establish a whole succession of replacement cats, dying and being replaced, and at one point the current cat is revealed to be Snowball the Fifth, painted to look like Snowball the Second so that Lisa doesn't have to grieve again. That's a joke about continuity, a joke about replacing actors, and a joke about how a family absorbs loss all in one dead cat. Right, we can finally deal with the annoyed grunt properly. The instruction in the script simply read, annoyed grunt. Dan Castellaneta asked Groening what an annoyed grunt was actually meant to sound like, and Groening's answer was, in effect, whatever you want. So Castellaneta reached for something he remembered from watching old Laurel and Hardy films as a child. There was a Scottish actor called Jimmy Finlayson who appeared in 33 of them, generally as the exasperated foil to Stan and Ollie. And when things went wrong, Finlayson would do this long, rising, agonized noise. Oh. Finlayson was doing that for a specific reason. He wanted to say damn, and he could not say damn because the censors in the 20s and 30s generally wouldn't let you. So he'd invented a substitute, a sound that carried the whole meaning of a swear word without technically being one. Castellaneta did the long version. Groening said it was too slow for animation timing and asked him to cut it down. And that's the whole story. A minced oath from the 1920s, compressed for pacing, delivered by an actor filling in a blank. There's an even older sighting, incidentally. The exclamation shows up in a BBC radio comedy called It's That Man Again, which ran from 1939 to 1949, as a catchphrase for a character named Miss Hotchkiss. Whether anyone involved knew that, I've no idea. Probably not. Some noises are just waiting to be found. The stage direction survived, which I love. The scripts kept saying annoyed grunt for years, and the writers eventually started putting it in episode titles. There's an episode called E-I-E-I Annoyed Grunt. There's one called G-I Annoyed Grunt. And there's Simpson Califragilistic Expiala Annoyed Gruntius, which is a title that has to be read twice. In 2001, it went into the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's not the only one. In an episode called Lisa the Iconoclast, the show spotlighted 2 words as a joke about how words get invented. The first is embiggen, used in a town motto, "A noble spirit embiggens the smallest man." The second is cromulent, which appears when one teacher tells another that embiggen is a perfectly cromulent word. The joke is that both words are obviously fake and both sound like they could be real. The punchline delivered over the following 2 decades is that they became real. Both have since been added to actual dictionaries. Embiggen has been used in physics papers. It escaped. Then there's ame, which the show did not invent but absolutely did weaponize. The flat, single-syllable expression of total indifference was in circulation before Springfield got hold of it. But the show used it so relentlessly, particularly in an episode called Hungry Hungry Homer, that it became the default written form globally, and the one that got completely away from them. Groundskeeper Willie, in an episode from season 7, describes the French as cheese-eating surrender monkeys. It's a throwaway line from a Scottish caretaker in a cartoon. Within a few years, it was appearing in serious political journalism, in newspapers, in the mouths of people who had no idea they were quoting an animated groundskeeper. Someone once made the point that this show is now quoted so often in ordinary English that it sits alongside Shakespeare and the Bible as a source of common phrases, which sounds like nonsense until you try to get through a week without hearing one of them. The catchphrase economy is worth a look too, mostly because the show got sick of it faster than the audience did. The early ones are Bart's, "Eat my shorts," "Ay caramba," "Don't have a cow, man." Those 3 were absolutely everywhere in 1990, printed on the merchandise, repeated by children in playgrounds on 2 continents, and quoted by people who had never seen the program. And by season 5, the writers had clearly had enough, because they made an episode about it. In Bart Gets Famous, Bart becomes a national sensation off the back of a single accidental line, delivered by mistake on live television. The line is, "I didn't do it." That's the whole catchphrase. It's not a joke. It has no content. And the episode follows it through the complete arc of merchandising, saturation, backlash, and abandonment, ending with the family accidentally performing every one of their own catchphrases in sequence while Lisa despairs. That's a program at the height of its commercial power, making a half hour about how hollow that power is, and then continuing to sell the shirts. I don't say that as a criticism. I think both things were sincere. The supporting cast have their own. Mr. Burns has excellent, which people now use in ordinary speech while doing the fingers. Nelson has the laugh, which has become one of the most widely used reaction sounds on the internet. Ned has the hi diddly ho. Dr. Nick has the greeting and the response, which is one of the few call and answer gags the show built into its own audience. And then there's Comic Book Guy, who produced possibly the most successful phrase of all without anyone realizing it at the time. Worst episode ever. 3 words, delivered as the ultimate verdict of a man who consumes media professionally and hates all of it. It has since become one of the most reliable formats on the internet, endlessly repurposed for anything anyone dislikes, which is a very funny outcome because the character exists specifically as a satire of fans who talk like that. The joke is being made about people who then adopted it as a way of talking. That happens to this show constantly, and I'm never sure whether the writers find it gratifying or exhausting. There's a blackboard in a 1998 episode called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, and it has caused more genuine excitement among mathematicians than any other object in television. The episode itself is straightforward. Homer has a midlife crisis, decides to become an inventor, and models himself on Thomas Edison. The title is a play on Edison's nickname, the Wizard of Menlo Park. Everything Homer builds goes wrong, obviously, but behind him, in one shot, is a blackboard covered in equations, and one of them is an apparent counterexample to Fermat's last theorem. Very briefly, and I'll keep this painless. Fermat's last theorem says that for whole numbers, you cannot have two numbers raised to the same power above 2 adding up to a third number raised to that power. It's simple to state, and it took mathematicians about 350 years to prove. Finally cracked by Andrew Wiles in the 90s. Homer's blackboard appears to break it. And here's the properly clever part. If you type Homer's numbers into your phone, it works. The sums come out. Fermat is wrong, and a cartoon man has done it. The reason it works on your phone is that your phone isn't accurate enough. It's what mathematicians call a near-miss solution. Go out far enough in the decimal places, and the whole thing falls apart. But on a standard calculator display, everything lines up perfectly. That was written by David X. Cohen, and he did not find it lying around. He wrote a computer program specifically to hunt for a near miss that would survive an ordinary calculator, purely so it could appear on a blackboard behind Homer for a few seconds, unremarked upon, in an episode about a man inventing an electric hammer. Cohen had, as a student, attended lectures by Ken Ribet, whose work was part of the groundwork that led to Wiles's proof. So the joke isn't random, it's a specific person making a specific gag for a field he'd actually studied in. And it's not even the only thing on that blackboard. Simon Singh, a science writer and physicist who'd worked at CERN and had written a book about Fermat, spotted the equation while watching at home and then noticed something else sitting above it. Another line on the board works out to an estimate for the mass of the Higgs boson. That episode aired in 1998. The Higgs boson was confirmed at CERN in 2012. The number on Homer's blackboard is in roughly the right region. Singh went and wrote a whole book about this, The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, which came out in 2013 and catalogs an absurd quantity of similar material across the series. Because the staff, it turns out, were stuffed with them. Physics degrees, maths degrees, advanced degrees from serious institutions. Cohen himself has published research papers. One writer had been a professor at Yale. There was a period where the room contained more academic mathematics than most maths departments. Singh's explanation for why so many of them ended up writing comedy is the best one I've heard. Mathematicians love logic, and what they love even more is bending logic, playing with it, and occasionally breaking it. And when you break logic in the right way, what comes out is a joke. Cohen's own comment on it has stayed with me. He said working in television makes it very easy to feel like you're contributing to the collapse of society, and that getting the chance to smuggle in something that glorifies mathematics cancels out the days spent writing jokes about bodily functions. He left eventually and co-created Futurama, where he had considerably more room to do this sort of thing and absolutely did not restrain himself. The reason so many of them were there in the first place comes down to a student magazine. The Harvard Lampoon is a comedy publication that has been running since the 1870s, and from the mid-80s onwards it functioned as an unofficial recruiting pipeline into American television comedy. A very large share of the show's early writing staff came through it. So did a lot of the people who went on to run other things afterwards. What made the pipeline unusual in this case is who was writing for it. The Lampoon drew from the whole university, which meant the comedy staff included people whose actual academic training was in mathematics and physics rather than English. They were funny, and they were also, in several cases, publishing researchers. That's the mechanism. Nobody at the show set out to hire mathematicians. They hired the funniest available people from a specific place, and that place happened to be full of them. The consequences show up everywhere once you know to look. There are equations and background shots that are correct. There are references that only pay off if you know a particular field. There's a whole strand of jokes about statistics and probability that go by without comment because they're not signposted. And it carried over. When Cohen went off to make Futurama, that show ended up with even more of it. to the point where one of the writers, Ken Keeler, who also wrote the lyrics to the songs we'll get to later, proved an original mathematical theorem specifically because an episode's plot required one, not referenced a theorem, proved a new one, wrote it on a whiteboard in the episode, and it has since been cited in actual mathematical literature as a genuine result. I find that completely delightful and slightly unhinged. A man with a doctorate solving a real problem in group theory because the plot of a cartoon about a delivery ship needed the maths to work. The general principle behind all of it, and I think this is why it lands rather than feeling smug, is that none of these jokes are load-bearing. You can watch the entire show, love it, and never notice a single equation. They're not there to make you feel stupid. They're there because somebody enjoyed putting them there. And the possibility that one viewer in 10,000 would freeze frame and grin was reward enough. That's a remarkably pure motive for anything made by a television studio. Here's a structural oddity that we've all just accepted. The Simpsons has an annual holiday during which none of it counts. The first Treehouse of Horror went out on the 25th of October, 1990. 3 horror segments, anthology format, and a framing device where Bart and Lisa tell each other ghost stories in the treehouse. It's been happening every year since, and they're up past the 35th installment now, which means these things have Roman numerals long enough to require a moment's arithmetic. The rule that makes it work is that nothing in them is canon. Characters die horribly and are fine next week. Springfield is destroyed repeatedly. The family are turned into monsters, eaten, sent to hell, replaced by robots, and none of it is ever referred to again, which means the writers get 1 episode a year with no consequences, no continuity obligations, and no requirement that anyone behave in character. If you want to know what a writer's room does when you remove every restriction, this is your answer, and the answer is mostly cannibalism. The credits gag is a small pleasure. Everyone's name gets a Halloween pun for the duration. Matt Groening becomes something suitably ghoulish, the writers get scare names, and it's done differently every year, which means somebody's job in the autumn is sitting down and finding a horror pun for every single member of staff. These episodes also carry a different content rating from the rest of the show. The main series generally sits at a family-friendly rating with the odd exception. Every single Treehouse of Horror gets bumped up a level, across the board without exception. It's the one strand that's officially allowed to be nastier. The technical landmark is Homer Cubed from Treehouse of Horror the 6th in 1995. Homer steps behind a bookcase and falls out of the 2-dimensional world into a fully 3-dimensional computer-generated one in 1995. On a television animation budget. There are effects in that segment that studios were still struggling with in feature films at the time, and it exists because a Halloween special had permission to try something that would have been unjustifiable in a normal episode. Treehouse of Horror the 5th is the one most people would nominate as the best. 3 segments. The Shinning, which is a Kubrick parody with the letter deliberately changed to avoid being sued and a joke made of the change. Time and Punishment, in which Homer breaks a toaster and destroys causality. And Nightmare Cafeteria, where the school begins eating the students. It's a half hour of unrestrained cruelty, and it's extremely funny. The only fixed point across the whole strand is Kang and Kodos, the 2 drooling, one-eyed aliens who turn up in some capacity in essentially every installment. They're the closest thing a non-canonical universe has to continuity, and their entire function is to appear, be disgusting, and leave. What I find genuinely interesting about the Treehouse episodes is what they reveal about the rest of the show. Because the ordinary episodes could do all of this, there's no rule stopping them. But the writers seem to understand instinctively that Springfield only works if it's mostly stable, mostly consequence-free in the other direction, and mostly kind. Give them 1 night a year to be horrible, and they'll happily go back to normal in the morning. That's a fairly good description of Halloween generally, when you think about it. A scheduling oddity that ran for years and confused everybody. The Halloween special routinely aired after Halloween. The reason is baseball. Fox held the broadcast rights to the postseason, which occupies late October, and the schedule got shoved around accordingly. So there were long stretches where the Halloween episode turned up in November, occasionally well into it, which is a bit like getting your advent calendar in January. The show made jokes about it. It didn't fix it, because it couldn't. The individual segments have their own conventions. They're usually parodies with the titles bent just far enough to be legally comfortable, which is a gag in itself. Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace. The Shinning, where the missing letter is explicitly addressed in dialogue by groundskeeper Willie, explaining they don't want to get sued. Dial Z for Zombies. Bart Simpson's Dracula. There's a version of nearly every horror property of the 20th century in there somewhere, and I've never once seen a title that wasn't at least a bit pleased with itself. Rightly so, I think. Some of them are the best jokes in the episode, and they're over before the segment starts. The framing device also disappeared. In the earliest installments, there's a wraparound, the treehouse, or a graveyard, or Marge stepping out to warn the audience that the episode is frightening. Over time, the wraparounds got looser and eventually stopped, and now the segments generally just start. Nobody announced that either. It simply stopped happening, and in the same quiet way that most changes on this show happen. There's a nice statistical coincidence attached to the strand as well. The show's 600th episode happened to fall on a Halloween special, which meant a milestone episode was also canonically not real, which I love, actually. 600 episodes of building a town, and the anniversary is the one where none of it counts. This is also where that couch gag I mentioned earlier ended up. Guillermo del Toro made one for a Halloween special that runs for well over 2 minutes and is essentially a short film in its own right. It's stuffed with references to horror cinema going back a century, packed so densely that people sat down and made annotated guides to it, and it has almost nothing to do with a family arriving at a sofa. At that point, the gag has stopped being a time filler and become the reason people tuned in, which I'd argue is the single clearest example of what this one night a year does to everybody involved. Give a man who makes monsters for a living 90 seconds of a cartoon, and he will hand you back a horror museum. And a small thing about the effects segment I mentioned. The three-dimensional sequence was farmed out to a specialist studio because nobody on the regular crew could do it. It cost a substantial amount for a few minutes of screen time in a Halloween special, and the reason it still holds up is that it was designed around its own limitations. Stuffed with a century of horror cinema references, dense enough that people made annotated guides, and with almost nothing to do with a family arriving at a sofa. The moment it tries something ambitious, it goes for a joke instead, which is how you make 1995 computer graphics survive 30 years. The other thing about Treehouse episodes is that they are frequently the funniest thing the show does in any given year now. Once a series has been running long enough that the regular episodes are constrained by decades of accumulated character, the one night where none of that applies stops being a novelty and starts being a relief. Nobody in Springfield gets older. That's the arrangement, and it's been the arrangement since the start. Bart has been 10 for the entire run. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been an infant for longer than most people's entire childhoods. Homer works at the same plant for the same owner who has never once remembered his name. The clever bit is what the show does with flashbacks, because a fixed present forces the past to move. When the early seasons showed Homer and Marge as teenagers, they were teenagers in the 1970s, complete with the music and the hair. As the show kept running, that stopped working, because a Homer who was a teenager in 1974 would be in his 60s. So the flashbacks quietly slid forward. Their youth was re-anchored to the 90s, then later than that. Nobody announces this. There's no in-universe explanation. The past simply drifts along behind the present, always the right distance away, and the show trusts you not to make a fuss. But it isn't a total reset every week, and the exceptions are interesting because they're not systematic. Some things stick permanently. Ned's widowhood, as we covered. Lisa's vegetarianism, established in season 7 and never once quietly dropped, partly because Paul and Linda McCartney guests starred on the condition that it be permanent. Apu's marriage to Manjula and their octuplets. Milhouse's parents separating. Meanwhile, Homer has had well over 100 jobs, and none of them ever leave a mark. The moment the show found the edge of what its audience would tolerate came in season 9, in an episode called The Principal and the Pauper. The premise is that Seymour Skinner is not Seymour Skinner. He's a man named Armin Tamzarian who assumed a dead soldier's identity and never gave it back, and the real Skinner turns up to reclaim his life. It is structurally a good episode. It's also the most hated thing the show has ever done. The reaction was severe enough that the episode ends with the town legally decreeing that everyone will go back to calling him Skinner and never mention it again. And the show has essentially honored that. Groening himself has been openly critical of it. What that taught everyone involved is quite specific. The audience will accept a floating timeline, an unfixable geography, a man surviving industrial accidents, and Halloween cannibalism. What they will not accept is being told that a character they know is somebody else underneath. There's a second disavowal worth mentioning. Season 6 has an episode called A Star is Burns, which brings in Jay Sherman from The Critic, another Brooks production. Groening was so unhappy about what he saw as using his show to advertise a different one that he had his name removed from the credits and said so publicly. That's the creator of the program going to the press about a crossover episode, which is funny because the show has done plenty of others without incident. The X-Files one, The Springfield Files, brought in Mulder and Scully, voiced by the actual actors. Simpsorama in November 2014 brought the Futurama crew back in time to Springfield, which is Cohen and Groening's other show visiting this one. And there's a Family Guy crossover, which is technically and legally an episode of Family Guy rather than an episode of this. The floating timeline is often described as lazy. I'd argue precisely the opposite. Keeping a show internally coherent while nothing progresses requires constant, invisible maintenance. And the fact that most people never notice the flashbacks moving is the evidence that it's being done well. Here's a practical use for all of this if you ever find yourself watching an episode cold and wanting to place it. You can date this show by feel fairly reliably without checking anything. If it's grounded, if the plot is about money or school or a marriage under strain, if the animation is slightly wobbly and the voices aren't quite settled, you're in the first 2 seasons. Homer sounds different, he's gruffer and slower, and the show hasn't yet decided how stupid he is. If the jokes are coming very fast and the plots are still recognizably domestic, that's the 3rd and 4th. This is the period most people mean when they talk about the show being at its peak, and the density is the reason. There are episodes from season 4 where you can pause anywhere and find a gag in the background you'd never noticed. If something genuinely surreal happens and nobody comments on it, that's 5 or 6. Homer goes to space. A man is buried in a wall. The show starts trusting that you'll follow it anywhere. If the episode isn't really about the family, you're in 7 or 8. That's when the supporting cast get their own stories, and it's also when the show starts examining itself. If Homer's doing something reckless and slightly unkind and the plot has left the town entirely, that's 9 through 12. The characterization broadened here, and this is where the arguments start. Then there's a very long stretch, roughly 13 through 32, that's harder to date by feel precisely because it's stable. That's the point. The show settled into a shape and held it. And if you can't tell whether an episode is from season 19 or season 26, that's not a criticism, that's the achievement. And from 33 onwards, you get format experiments again. Episodes that break structure, tell things out of order, or hand the whole half hour to a supporting character. Cue one more continuity note that I enjoy. The show has now shown Bart's 11th birthday, and it has shown quite a few of his 10th. The same is true across the board. Birthdays happen, and then the age doesn't move. Nobody in the writing room has ever felt obliged to explain this with some in-universe scientific reason, and honestly, what would they even say, even though they've admitted it's a deliberate creative choice? The clearest illustration of the reset is Homer's employment history. He has been an astronaut, a boxer, a monorail conductor, a snowplow operator, a food critic, a truck driver, a bodyguard, a missionary, a carnival worker, a grease salesman. He has been Mr. Burns's personal assistant. He has run a snowplow business into the ground, been a country music manager, worked as a mascot, and at one point simply worked from home for a genial billionaire who turned out to be a supervillain. By any reasonable count, it's well over 100 jobs, and the show eventually made a joke of it by having a character list a chunk of them aloud. And at the end of none of those episodes, he winds up back at the plant, asleep at his desk with no explanation offered. That's the machinery. The reset isn't a failure of continuity, it's the engine that makes the format work. Because Homer can be anything for 21 minutes and lose it by the credits, the writers have access to the entire world without ever having to change the show. Any premise is available. No premise has consequences. The cost is obvious. And it's the thing people mean when they say the characters have stopped developing. You cannot have both. A program where events accumulate has to end because accumulation has a direction. A program where they don't can run forever, and this one has chosen forever with both hands. What I'd say in its defense is that the show is honest about the trade. It has never pretended these people are growing. The rare occasions it lets something stick, a death, a marriage, a decision, land harder precisely because the default is that nothing does. There is exactly one episode of The Simpsons that you cannot legally watch on Disney Plus or most official streaming services. It's called Stark Raving Dad. It's the first episode of season 3, and it aired on the 19th of September, 1991. The plot is this. Homer's white work shirt goes pink in the wash because Bart's red cap ended up in the load. Mr. Burns takes the pink shirt as evidence of political radicalism and orders a psychological evaluation. Bart fills in Homer's assessment form for him, ticking boxes at random, and Homer is committed. Inside the institution, he shares a room with a large, bald man who says he is Michael Jackson. He is not Michael Jackson. He's a bricklayer from Paterson, New Jersey, named Leon Kompowski, who explains at the end that he'd been an angry and unhappy man until he started talking in Michael Jackson's voice and noticed it made everyone around him happier, which in turn made him happier. So he simply kept doing it. The character was voiced by Michael Jackson, credited as John J. Smith. The detail most people don't know is that the singing isn't him. Jackson did the speaking voice, and the songs in the episode, including the birthday song Bart Writes for Lisa, were performed by a sound-alike singer named Kip Lennon. Accounts of why vary, generally involving contractual issues with his record label. So the episode contains a real Michael Jackson performance and a fake one side by side. In a story about a man pretending to be Michael Jackson, there's a related piece of history from around the same period. Do the Bartman, which went to #1 in the UK singles chart in 1991, was written and produced by Michael Jackson with Brian Lauren and performed by Nancy Cartwright as Bart. Jackson's involvement went uncredited for years. In 2019, following the documentary Leaving Neverland and the renewed scrutiny of Jackson that came with it, the producers pulled Stark Raving Dad. Al Jean and James L. Brooke both spoke about the decision publicly. It was removed from streaming, removed from syndication, and reprinted copies of the season. 3 box set now omitted entirely. When the round-the-clock streaming channel launched, it wasn't on that either. It remains the only episode fully withdrawn from circulation. For contrast, there are several episodes that were temporarily restricted and then restored. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, which opened season 9, features the World Trade Center heavily, including a substantial sequence set at the base of the towers. It was pulled from syndication after September 2001 and quietly returned to rotation some years later. And an episode called Blame It on Lisa, set in Rio, caused sufficient offense in Brazil that it was withdrawn there specifically. Those two came back. Stark Raving Dad has not. I'm not going to editorialize on it. People have strong views in both directions, and I don't think a video you're falling asleep to is the place to sort that out. What I'll say is that it's a genuinely unusual situation in television. Shows get episodes edited or footnoted or wrapped in a content warning. Very few have one that simply ceases to be available in every format permanently. If you own an original pressing of the Season 3 DVDs, you have something that is no longer manufactured. There's a footnote to the Kompowski story that I think is worth having. The character came back. In a later season, more than a decade after the original, Leon Kompowski reappears in an episode, and this time he's voiced by someone else entirely, doing a different impression. He'd apparently never moved on from his Michael Jackson impression and never taken up a new voice. So there's a version of the character still in circulation in an episode you can watch tonight, while the original is unavailable. The show effectively has a sequel to something that no longer exists. The other thing worth saying is that Stark Raving Dad was, before all of this, extremely well regarded. It opens a season that many people would name as one of the show's strongest. The plot is a genuinely sweet story about a brother forgetting his sister's birthday, and the resolution is that they write her a song together. It won admirers at the time, and held up for nearly 30 years, which makes the withdrawal a strange kind of loss, distinct from an episode being bad or offensive. It isn't gone because of what's in it. It's gone because of who is in it. There's a small collector's consequence. Copies of the Season 3 set pressed before 2019 contain the episode. Copies pressed after don't, which means somewhere in a lot of people's houses, on a shelf, in a box that cost about 20 quid at the time, there's a physical object holding something that is no longer commercially available in any form anywhere in the world. Nobody who bought it was thinking about that. I'd also note, for completeness, that the show has never gone back and edited it or released a version with the character recast or issued any kind of alternate cut. It was simply taken off the table in full with no replacement offered. Given how much of modern media handling involves footnotes, warnings, and edits, a clean and total withdrawal is now the unusual option. Right, that's the heavy one done. Let's talk about something lighter. In Season 8, a character dies on a rocket ship on the way back to his home planet, and a caption informs the audience that this is real and it happened. The character is Poochie, and the episode is The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show. The premise is that Itchy and Scratchy is losing viewers, so the network adds a new character to freshen it up. Poochie is a dog with sunglasses and a skateboard who talks about being extreme. He's designed by committee, focus grouped into existence, and universally hated on arrival. The episode is the show preemptively attacking the exact criticism it knew was coming. It contains a scene where fans complain that the program has declined, and another where a character points out that these are cartoon characters on a cartoon, and it's arguably not worth this level of scrutiny. That went out in 1997. People are still using clips from it in arguments about the show today, which is either vindication or a trap, depending on your view. Now, the other one from that season, and for my money, the strangest half hour the show has ever made. Homer's Enemy from May 1997, written by John Swartzwelder and directed by Jim Reardon. Mr. Burns hires a man named Frank Grimes, who has worked for everything he has, studied at night, survived an industrial accident, and clawed his way into a modest job. Grimes is introduced to Homer, and Grimes does what no character in the show's history had ever done. He looks at Homer's life properly. Homer has a large house, 2 cars, 3 children, a loving wife. He has been to space. He has met presidents. He has won a Grammy. He holds a job in nuclear safety that he is manifestly unqualified for, and he sleeps through most of it. Grimes cannot bear it. And the episode does not resolve in his favor. It resolves with Grimes destroyed by the sheer unfairness of it, and everyone at his funeral laughing at a joke Homer makes in his sleep. That episode consistently sits at the top of the show's ratings on IMDb. It's an episode that argues at length and convincingly that its own protagonist should not exist, and that his life is an offense against every reasonable person, and the writers put it out anyway. The show has done this repeatedly. There's a clip show hosted by Troy McClure framed as a behind-the-scenes special, which addresses viewer questions about the characters and includes an alternate ending to the Who Shot Mr. Burns story in which Smithers is the culprit. There's Behind the Laughter, which parodies the music documentary format by presenting The Simpsons as real actors whose show declined due to drug problems, contract disputes, and creative exhaustion. It aired in season 11, which is roughly when people had started saying exactly that about the actual program, and then the format experiments, which are their own pleasure. 22 short films about Springfield abandons the family almost entirely and follows townspeople through interlocking vignettes, one of which is a 5-minute sequence about Skinner burning his dinner and lying about it that has become one of the most quoted things the show has ever produced. Trilogy of Error tells one evening 3 times from 3 perspectives. Brick Like Me renders an entire episode as plastic construction bricks. Eternal moonshine of the Simpson mind runs backwards through Homer's memory. More recently, in season 34, there's an episode built around fictional hackers threatening to release unseen footage that would destroy the franchise, which then just shows you a series of increasingly deranged sketches. 30-odd years of a program keeping a running commentary on its own decline, while not declining enough to make the commentary accurate. I don't know what to call that other than nerve. There's one more piece of self-commentary I can't leave out because it's the most cynical thing the show has ever produced, and it did it on purpose. The Simpsons spin-off showcase is presented as 3 pilots for series built around supporting characters. One is a detective show for Chief Wiggum, one is a variety hour, one is a cheesy sitcom in which Moe is the lead, guided by Grandpa's spirit in a love tester machine with a laugh track and a studio audience. The joke is that all 3 are exactly the sort of thing a successful show gets pressured into making. And all 3 are terrible in precisely the way those things are terrible. It's a network pitching document turned into an episode, and it aired in the same period as the Poochie episode, which tells you what was on the writers' minds that year. A detail about Poochie, incidentally, that I think is perfect. The character's voice is provided in the episode by Homer, who is cast as him and immediately starts making suggestions about the script. So the show is simultaneously satirizing executive interference, focus grouping, and the actor who thinks he can improve the material. 3 targets, 1 dog. And the behind-the-scenes special I mentioned, the one hosted by Troy McClure, has a claim to being the first time a sitcom did that. It answers viewer questions, addresses long-running speculation about characters directly, and shows genuine unaired material, including alternate takes and cut scenes. That was 1995, before behind-the-scenes content was a routine part of how television talked about itself. What all of these have in common is a slightly uncomfortable confidence. This is a show that has been telling its audience it's past its best since roughly its 7th year on air, and has now been on air for another 30. At some point, the running joke about decline outlasted the thing it was joking about, and I'm not sure any program has ever been in that position before. There's a version of that which is smug. Somehow it lands as generous instead, and I think it's because the show never exempts itself. When it mocks bad television, it includes itself in the category every time without a wink. Danny Elfman wrote the theme in the car. That's the story he's told more or less consistently for decades. He had a meeting with Groening, who described the show and mentioned he wanted something in the spirit of the big retro-futurist television music of the 50s and 60s. Elfman went out to his car, drove home, and had the thing essentially finished in his head by the time he arrived. He has described it as one of the easiest pieces he ever wrote, and also as the most popular thing he has ever done, which must be a strange combination to live with. He has an enormous film career. He wrote Batman. and the piece of music that will outlive all of it took him a car journey. It has never been replaced. Rearranged, yes. The version most of us hear in our heads is a later arrangement, the one that came in around season 3, but the melody itself has been untouched since 1989. Season 1 was scored by Richard Gibbs. A couple of early second season episodes went to other composers while the production worked out what it wanted. And then Alf Clausen arrived and stayed for 27 years. I want to spend a moment on Clausen because I think he's the most underappreciated person in the show's history. He scored or orchestrated close to 600 episodes, and crucially, he did it with a live orchestra. 35 musicians in a room playing to picture every week for a cartoon. Not a synthesizer mock-up, not a library, an actual standing orchestra on a television comedy, which by the 90s was already an absurd extravagance and by the 2010s was essentially unheard of. That's why the show sounds the way it does. When an episode does a swelling, sincere, emotional moment and it lands, the reason it lands is that there are real strings underneath it, playing it straight. Clausen never scored the jokes as jokes. He scored them as though they were happening in a film, which is exactly why the gag works. He won 2 Emmys for music and lyrics, both with the writer Ken Keeler. One in 1997 for We Put the Spring in Springfield, which is a full Broadway pastiche about a burlesque house, and one in 1998 for You're Checkin' In, which is a song about a celebrity rehab clinic. He was nominated more than 20 times overall and won 5 Annie Awards. In 2017, he was let go. The reason given was cost. He was in his 70s, he had been there since the 2nd season, and he found out he was finished on a phone call. He sued. The case was eventually resolved without a public verdict, and he was given a composer emeritus credit for a while, which I've always found a slightly awkward thing to hand someone in that situation. Alf Clausen died on the 29th of May, 2025 at 84. The scoring since has been handled by Bleeding Fingers, a music company co-founded by Hans Zimmer, with various composers on individual episodes. Zimmer himself scored the 2007 film. Fun detail to end on. Because Clausen was writing for a live orchestra to picture, the scores exist as actual manuscript. Hundreds of episodes of real orchestral writing for a program about a man who works at a nuclear plant and cannot operate a toaster. Somewhere there are filing cabinets full of it. The songs are their own catalog, and there are a lot more of them than people remember. There's the Monorail Number, which is a full musical theater pastiche performed by a con man to sell a town a transport system. There's a song where Mr. Burns lists the animals he'd like to make clothing from, which is one of the more disturbing things ever set to a jaunty tune. There's a baseball number in the style of an old sports ballad. There's a song about a car seat sign that Homer becomes obsessed with and forms a barbershop quartet around. Ken Keeler wrote a great many of the lyrics, including both Emmy winners, and the thing that makes his work distinctive is that the songs are structurally correct. They aren't parodies of songs. They're songs with proper verse and chorus construction and internal rhyme that happen to be about ridiculous things. That's the same principle as the scoring. Play it straight and let the content be the joke. The show has also used real musicians unusually well, mostly by not making a fuss. The McCartneys, whose one lasting condition we talked about earlier, are the obvious case. They turn up, they play, nobody makes a meal of it, and the scene is about Lisa rather than about them. There's an episode where a Hollywood composer arrives, and there's a running joke about him being unable to write anything without it sounding like a film score. There are countless in-jokes about session musicians and orchestras that only make sense if you've worked in that world, which suggests they were written for the people in the recording room as much as the audience. And then there's the thing I always come back to with the music. When you watch an emotional ending in this show, the pattern is nearly always the same. The jokes stop. A character says something plain, and there are strings underneath it, played properly, taking it entirely seriously. Comedy that can turn sincere in about 4 seconds is rare, and most shows can't do it because the audience doesn't trust the shift. This one could, and the reason is that the orchestra never once played it as a gag. A closing note on the theme itself, because it's had an odd afterlife. It's one of a very small number of pieces of television music that people can hum without being able to name the composer. It's been played by orchestras as a concert piece, arranged for every instrument you can think of, and used as a warm-up by school bands worldwide, which means there are children learning to play it who have never watched an episode. It's also unusually difficult, which nobody expects. There's a lot going on rhythmically. The brass writing is genuinely demanding, and the whole thing moves through more harmonic territory in 90 seconds than most title music attempts in its entire existence. It sounds simple because it's played well, and it has never been swapped out. Not for an anniversary, not for the film, not for the high-definition rebuild. Show after show refreshes its titles to sound current. This one worked out in 1989 that it had something it would never improve on and has left it alone ever since. Which, given how much of this program is built out of accidents and compromises, is a rather nice thing to be able to say about the first thing you hear. This is the one bit of Simpsons lore that non-fans always want to talk about, and I have to be honest, it's my least favorite. You know the list. In an episode called Bart to the Future, broadcast on the 19th of March 2000, there's a scene set decades ahead in which Lisa is president and inherits a budget crunch from the Trump administration. That's 16 years before it happened. In When You Dish Upon a Star, from 1998, there's a sign identifying 20th Century Fox as a division of the Walt Disney Company. Disney bought Fox in 2019, which means the joke eventually became the reason the show streams where it does now, and the studio that owns The Simpsons had its acquisition predicted by The Simpsons. There's a smartwatch, there are various bits of technology that turned up later, there's a whole cottage industry of videos and articles pulling frames out of context. And I want to gently take the air out of it because the explanation is not mysterious, and I think it's more interesting than the mystery. You have a show that has produced over 800 episodes. Each one is stuffed with background gags, signs, throwaway lines, and 1-second visual jokes. Call it a few dozen discrete predictions or references per episode, conservatively. That's a number with a lot of zeros on the end. Now add the second factor. This is a satirical program whose entire method is to look at contemporary culture and extrapolate the stupidest plausible version of it. That's not fortune-telling, that's the job description. If you spend 3 decades asking what's the most ridiculous thing that could happen next, and the world continues to be ridiculous, you're going to be right sometimes. And then the third factor, which is the one nobody mentions. Nobody catalogs the misses. There is no viral video listing the thousands of gags about the future that turned out to be completely wrong, because a wrong prediction isn't a prediction, it's just a joke that didn't age into anything. That's survivorship bias, and it's the entire engine of the phenomenon. The Trump one in particular gets misrepresented constantly. The joke in that scene isn't that a specific man would become president. It's that Lisa inherits a wrecked country from a preceding administration, and the writers needed a name that would read to a 2,000 audience as an absurd, gaudy, unserious choice. He was, at that point, a property developer who did adverts. The joke was the absurdity. The absurdity is what stopped being absurd. The writers have said as much on multiple occasions, generally with the weariness of people who have been asked this in every interview for a decade. My favorite response to the whole thing came in season 34, in an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout, which contains a sequence where a 30-year-old Bart appears in the very first episode to deliver predictions to his own family. And the list he gives is deliberately ludicrous. Milhouse names a specific Nobel Prize winner in economics. He mentions a football result. He mentions the Disney purchase and then adds that Fox is later bought by a fast food chain who seem to be taking over everything. That's the show telling you the joke is the volume. Say enough things and some of them come true, and the ones that do will be remembered as prophecy, while the fast food chain buying Fox will be remembered as a gag. I'd take the maths blackboard over any of this personally. One of them is a coincidence generated by scale, and the other is a man writing a bespoke computer program to hide something clever behind Homer's head where he assumed nobody would ever find it. There's a second-order problem with all this that's worth flagging, because it's the bit that actually causes trouble. A great many of the images circulating as Simpsons predictions are fake, not misinterpreted, fabricated. Somebody takes a still from the show, alters the text on a sign or the image on a screen, and posts it as evidence that the program predicted a news event from last week. This has happened with elections, disasters, celebrity deaths, and financial crashes, and it happens within hours of the event itself. The forgeries are usually crude if you look, but nobody looks because the claim arrives preloaded with a story you already believe. The show's own writers have spent years having to say, no, we didn't do that one, that isn't ours, which produces the genuinely odd situation where a comedy program has become a recurring vector for internet misinformation entirely against its will, because it's built up such a reputation for foresight that any claim made in its name is believed by default. There's a small irony there that I do enjoy. The reason people believe the fakes is the handful of real ones. And the reason the real ones exist is volume and satire, which is to say, no reason at all. For balance, there are predictions in the show that are simply good observation rather than coincidence. The Disney one is the clearest example because that wasn't a lucky guess. It was a joke about corporate consolidation made by people who worked inside the industry and could see the direction of travel. Media companies were eating each other in the 90s, and the obvious endpoint was that one of them would eat Fox. Writing that down in 1998 isn't clairvoyance, it's paying attention at work. Same with the three-eyed fish in a way. That's not a prediction of anything specific, it's the entirely reasonable expectation that a badly run nuclear facility will eventually do something visible to the wildlife downstream, dramatized as a joke. So I'd separate the pile into three. There's fabricated nonsense, which is most of it now. There's coincidence generated by scale, which is the bulk of the genuine ones. And then there's a small number of gags that were just accurate about how the world works, which are the only ones I think are actually interesting. An episode of this show takes about 6 months to make, not to write, to exist. That number surprises people, and it's the most useful piece of context for understanding almost everything about how the program behaves. The pipeline goes roughly like this. An idea gets pitched and broken into an outline. Someone goes away and writes a draft. The draft comes back into the room and gets rewritten collectively, which in this show's case has always been a genuine group activity rather than a polite pass. Then a table read, which is where a lot of material dies. Then the script goes to animation for an animatic, which is a rough time version. Then layout, which is the big, slow, expensive stage where the actual shot construction happens. And then right at the end, more rewrites, because things that were funny on the page turn out not to be funny when a character is actually doing them. 6 months for 21 minutes. That lead time explains why the show has always struggled to be topical, why the writers' strikes affected it strangely, and why a global emergency in March could be worked around without missing a broadcast slot. There's always a queue of half-finished episodes moving through the building. The animation itself has passed through 3 houses. Klasky Chupo did the original shorts and the first 3 seasons, which is why those years look the way they do, loose and slightly wild. Film Roman took over from season 4 and held it for well over 2 decades, and that's the version most people picture. Since season 28, it's been done in-house. Underneath all of them sits the overseas work, the in-betweens, the coloring, the enormous volume of frame-by-frame labor has gone to studios abroad for essentially the entire run, with ACOM in South Korea being the longest standing. That is standard practice across the whole American animation industry, and it's rarely discussed, but there is a straightforward truth in it. The drawings you have been looking at your entire life were mostly made by people whose names you will never see. Technically, the show was hand-drawn cell animation up to season 13. Paint on acetate, physical objects. The switch to digital ink and paint came properly at the start of season 14, with an episode called The Great Louse Detective, though they'd tested it earlier, once in season 7 and again in season 12. The budget, as of figures reported around 2011, sat at roughly $5 million per episode. 2 more bits of production history I'm fond of. The first is the pilot that wasn't. The episode intended to launch the series was called Some Enchanted Evening. It came back from animation in such poor condition that it was effectively unusable and had to be substantially redone. So the schedule was reshuffled and a Christmas episode went out first instead on the 17th of December 1989, which means the show's famous festive opening exists because of a production disaster, and Some Enchanted Evening eventually aired at the end of that first season, out of order, with nobody the wiser. The second is about shape. For its first 19 seasons, the show was made in the old square television format, and the writers used it. Gags were composed at the top and bottom of the frame, specifically because that space existed. When the whole back catalog went on to streaming in 2019, it was presented cropped to widescreen, which chopped the tops and bottoms off and quietly amputated a substantial number of visual jokes. There was a sustained complaint about it, and in May 2020, the option to watch the classic episodes in their original shape was restored. I think that's the most Simpsons thing in this entire section. A format argument conducted publicly about whether a joke drawn in 1993 in the corner of a frame is allowed to still be there. Something I glossed over that deserves its own moment. The layout stage. Layout is where somebody takes the script and the animatic and works out what every single shot actually looks like, where the camera is, where everyone stands, what's in the background, how a character crosses a room. It's slow and it's expensive, and it's the stage where an episode either becomes visually interesting or becomes people standing in a line talking. The reason it matters here is that this show is directed like live action. It's a storyboard-based production shot, single camera style, which means somebody is making decisions about lenses and framing and coverage that a cartoon doesn't strictly need. That's why parodies of specific films work in this show and don't in most others. When the program does a horror sequence, it's actually shot like a horror sequence. There's also no studio audience and never has been, which sounds obvious for animation but had implications. Sitcoms of that era were built around a laugh, with pauses engineered for it. This show wasn't, so the jokes could be quieter, faster, and stacked on top of each other. You can put a gag in the background of a shot that nobody laughs at because nobody's meant to notice it that week. Given the 6-month pipeline, the only genuinely late elements are the ones that can be dropped in at the end. That's part of why the chalkboard and the couch survive as institutions. And it's why occasional topical references can land relatively close to events while the plots themselves never can. There's one more consequence of the long lead time that I find quietly sad. It means the show has occasionally broadcast episodes featuring performers who had died between recording and transmission. That's happened more than once across nearly 4 decades, and there's no good way to handle it. You either pull the episode, which erases the last thing they did, or you broadcast it, and people hear a voice they know is gone. That's not a joke or a piece of trivia, it's just a fact about making something slowly for a very long time. And it's the sort of thing you only notice when you start counting the months. Sam Simon deserves a proper mention here, because you can't understand the show without him, and most people have never heard the name. Simon came in at the beginning alongside Groening and Brooks, and his job title was Creative Supervisor, which undersells it enormously. He assembled the original writing staff. He was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who was there, the person who built the comedic machinery, established how the room would work, and turned a set of drawings into a program with a sensibility. He left after 4 seasons, following friction with Groening that neither of them ever fully aired in public. And crucially, he kept his executive producer credit and his share of the profits for the rest of his life. He died on the 8th of March, 2015, having spent a great deal of that money on animal welfare and various other causes. 4 seasons of work, and a permanent claim on one of the most profitable things in television. After that, the show passes between people, and if you know what you're listening for, you can hear the handovers. Al Jean and Mike Rice took seasons 3 and 4, faster, denser, more jokes per minute. That's the start of what people call the golden run. David Merkin had 5 and 6 and pushed the whole thing towards surrealism, bigger premises, stranger swerves, a willingness to abandon plausibility mid-episode. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein had 7 and 8, and their instinct was to go sideways into the supporting cast. That's why those 2 years contained both the vignette experiment and the Frank Grimes episode. They were interested in what Springfield looked like from anywhere other than the sofa. Those 2 are my favorites, if I'm being honest about it, and I think it's because they were the first people to treat the background characters as though they had lives running the whole time. Mike Scully had 9 through 12, and that's the era people argue about. The characterization broadened, Homer became considerably more reckless and less sympathetic, and the plots got wilder. Whatever your view, it's the period where the show stopped being grounded and never fully went back. Then Al Jean returned and stayed for 15 seasons, which is the single longest tenure by a mile. That's the era of stability. The show stopped changing shape, settled into a reliable rhythm, and outlasted everything. People are quite sniffy about that period, and I've never fully understood why. 20 years of keeping something enormous upright week after week is a much harder trick than any of the flashy stuff, and nobody hands out credit for it. And since season 33, Matt Selman has been the primary hand, with a noticeable appetite for breaking the format. Non-linear episodes, cinematic direction, more experimental structures. Enough of a shift that critics who had stopped writing about the show started again. From season 38, he takes it on alone, with Gene stepping back to a consulting role. One more figure worth knowing. Around 154 people have received a writing credit on this program. The most prolific by a distance is John Swartzwelder, with 59 episodes, including a startling proportion of the ones people would name as favorites. He is also famously reclusive, gave almost no interviews for decades, and reportedly wrote much of his material in a coffee shop until smoking bans forced him to install a booth in his house instead. The strikes left marks too. The writers' dispute of 2007 and 2008 shortened season 19. The 2023 dispute cut season 35 down to 18 episodes. Because of the long lead time we talked about, the disruption showed up on screen later and more gently than it did for live-action shows, but it showed up. What I take from all this is that the show is not one thing. It's a building that a series of different people have lived in, and every one of them redecorated. 2 more bits of context that explain a lot about the eras. The first is the scheduling war. The show started out on Sundays, and then for seasons 2 through 5, it was moved to Thursdays at 8. Directly opposite The Cosby Show, which was the most successful program on American television at the time. That was a deliberate act of aggression by a network with nothing to lose against a network with everything to protect. It's also the origin of the show's single biggest audience. The episode Bart Gets an F, which opened season 2, drew somewhere around 33 million viewers and beat Cosby outright. That remains the show's high watermark, and it happened in the second season, which means the most watched episode is 35 years old, and the following 750 were all downhill in pure numbers. From season 6, it went back to Sundays and stayed there, anchoring what the network eventually branded as its animation block. The second bit of context is the feud, which is my favorite piece of political trivia attached to any sitcom. In 1992, President George Bush said in a speech that American families should be more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons. The show's response was to re-air an episode with a new tag in which Bart, watching the speech, says that his family are just like the Waltons, in that they're also praying for an end to the Depression. That could have been the end of it. It wasn't. Some seasons later, the show made an entire episode in which a fictionalized Bush moves in across the road from the family, falls out with Bart, and ends up in a physical altercation with Homer in a sewer. A sitting president criticized a cartoon, and the cartoon spent the next 4 years getting even. I'm not aware of another example of that in either direction. And on the writers, one last thread, Conan O'Brien wrote for the show for a short spell before leaving for late night. Greg Daniels was there in the same period and went on to make the American version of The Office and Parks and Recreation. David X. Cohen went to Futurama. The Room in the early 90s was in retrospect one of the most consequential gatherings of comedy writers ever assembled. And at the time, it was a group of young people writing jokes for a show about a yellow family that everyone assumed was a fad. Let's finish with scale because some of it is genuinely funny once you look closely. Here's my favorite piece of bureaucratic lore in the whole franchise. The show has 3 separate 800th episodes. There's the 800th episode overall, which went out in December 2025. There's the 800th episode broadcast on Fox, which is a different one because some episodes were made exclusively for streaming and don't count towards that tally. And there's the 800th production episode, which is different again because episodes are made in one order and broadcast in another. 3 milestones, 3 different episodes, all correct. Somebody has to keep that spreadsheet, and I'd like to buy them a drink. In August 2014, the cable channel FXX ran a marathon of every episode then in existence, 552 of them back-to-back over 12 days. At the time, it was the longest continuous marathon in television history. It was also that channel's highest-rated day ever, which tells you something about what people will do with a fortnight. Streaming has taken that further in a way that's difficult to picture. In December 2025, Disney announced that the show had passed 1 billion hours streamed on their platform across that year alone. Not since launch, in 1 year. There's also been a round-the-clock channel running since early 2025 that just plays it forever, which is either a wonderful thing or a slightly worrying one. Then, the guest stars. The show holds the world record for most guest stars in a television series, with over 800 of them logged by 2020, and it's kept going since. The best ones are the ones that were kept quiet. Dustin Hoffman played Lisa's substitute teacher in season 2, and was credited under a pseudonym Sam Edick, which is a pun you have to say out loud. Elizabeth Taylor came in to record Maggie's first word, which is 2 syllables. Leonard Nimoy turned up twice, once to bless a monorail. Johnny Cash voiced a talking coyote in Homer's chili-induced hallucination and did it completely straight, which is why the sequence works. The awards record is peculiar, 37 Emmys. In 1996, it became the first animated series ever to win a Peabody, which is a serious journalism and broadcasting honor and not something cartoons were previously in the room for. Time named it the greatest television series of the 20th century. The family got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame on the 14th of January 2000. And in all that time, it has never once been nominated for Outstanding Comedy Series. They tried twice in the early 90s by submitting into that category instead of the animation one. It didn't take. The show is permitted to be the best animated program repeatedly and forever, and is not permitted to be a comedy. I've thought about that a fair bit, and I've concluded it's fine, actually. Categories are for other people's convenience. As of now, the show is renewed through a 40th season, and there's a second film scheduled for September 2027, which means that a thing sketched in a lobby in 15 minutes because a man didn't want to sell his comic strip has a release date in it for the back end of this decade. The commercial footprint is the part that's hardest to hold in your head, so let me try. Beyond the shirts and the early merchandising wave, there have been dozens of video games across every console generation since the late 80s, including a genuinely well-liked arcade cabinet where 4 players control the family and hit people with a skipping rope and a vacuum cleaner. There have been comics published for decades. There were confectionery sponsorships. There have been board games, pinball tables, an official cookbook, and a range of collectible figurines detailed enough that people display them in cabinets. At Universal's parks, the ride replaced a much-loved existing attraction, which caused a certain amount of grumbling from people who had loved the previous one, and there's a separate 4-dimensional attraction that opened in South Carolina in 2019. Then the films. The 2007 feature took around $527 million worldwide against a production budget of roughly $75 million. And at the time of release, it was the second highest grossing traditionally animated film ever made. It was directed by David Silverman, and it had 11 credited writers, which is either a warning sign or a description of how the show has always worked, depending on your view. There are also 2 short films, both centered on Maggie, both screened theatrically in front of other studios' features. The first, from 2012, was nominated for an Academy Award for Animated Short. That's the franchise's first Oscar nomination, and it went to a wordless 4-minute film about the baby. There's a strange justice in that. The character who has said almost nothing in nearly 4 decades is the one who nearly won them an Academy Award. And there's an official podcast now announced by Nancy Cartwright, bringing in writers and directors to talk about how it was all made, which is roughly what I'm doing here, except with the actual people involved and considerably better sourcing. The last number I'll give you is a small one rather than a large one. Around 154 people have written for this program. That's it. That's the whole authorship of the thing across every episode, every era, every argument about quality. 154 names, most of which nobody outside the industry could pick out of a lineup, who between them built a town that a substantial fraction of the planet can navigate from memory. One more piece of scale, and it's the one that actually explains the show's longevity better than the awards do. The real money in American television has never been in the original broadcast. It's in syndication, which is what happens afterwards, when episodes are sold on to be shown repeatedly for years. A program needs a large back catalog for that to work, which is why shows fight so hard to reach a certain number of episodes and then become extremely difficult to cancel. This show blew through that threshold in the early 90s and never stopped, which meant that for decades it existed in 2 forms at once. There was the new episode on a Sunday, watched by a shrinking audience. And there was the permanent parallel version running in reruns somewhere in the world at essentially every hour of the day, watched by an enormous number of people who had no idea which season anything was from. That's why the ratings decline never mattered in the way it would for any other program. The live audience is now a small fraction of what it was at the peak, and it's completely beside the point. The show's value was never the Sunday night number, it was the library. Streaming has made that even more pronounced. The reason a company will pay for a catalog like this is not that people will sit and watch it attentively. It's that they'll leave it on. It's the television equivalent of a kitchen radio. And there is an enormous amount of money in being the thing people put on while doing something else. Which is, when you think about it, more or less what I'm doing to you right now, and I'm at peace with that. So that's a couple of hours of it, and we've barely gone below the surface. I keep coming back to that stage direction. Annoyed grunt, 2 words in a script, no guidance, no intention behind them beyond needing a noise to happen. And a bloke in a booth reached back to a Scottish comedian from the 1920s who was trying to swear without swearing and made a sound that ended up in the dictionary. Almost everything we've talked about tonight has that shape. A colorist solving a hairline problem and inventing the most recognizable palette in animation. A writer hiding a bespoke piece of mathematics behind a cartoon man's head. A street map of Portland subtly inspired many of the characters' names. A tire fire that nobody ever put out because nobody ever needed to. None of it was planned, most of it stuck. That's really why a show like this develops archaeology. It ran long enough and loosely enough and with enough different people passing through that the accidents piled up into a landscape. There's no bottom to it. I could do another 2 hours on the guest stars alone and probably will. There's one more thing I wanted to say about it though. The reason I find this show worth this much attention isn't the jokes and it isn't the records. It's that it's one of the very few pieces of popular culture that has been running long enough to have genuinely changed hands. Not once. Repeatedly. The people who made the version you loved as a child are mostly not the people making it now. And the people making it now weren't born when the lobby sketch happened. And it still holds together. You can put on an episode from any decade, and it's recognizably the same town with the same tire fire and a man asleep at a desk he shouldn't be allowed near. That's not nostalgia doing the work. That's a couple of hundred people over 37 years agreeing without ever writing it down on what Springfield is, which is a decent note to stop on, I reckon. It'll all still be there in the morning. Take care of yourself.